So, I started volunteering at a wildlife refuge recently, and one of the resident animals is awfully weird. So, like I said, I started volunteering there about a month ago. I go in on Sundays and Saturdays for a 5-hour shift and basically just feed the animals, change their water, give medication to the ones who need it, and then discuss miscellaneous work. This is a wildlife refuge though, so the end goal is to return as many of the animals as we can that are delivered to us by animal control back to the wild as possible. So, some animals, for one reason or another, unfortunately can't go back to the wild because of injuries, imprinting, or what have you. These are our resident animals, who are permanent stays at the refuge. On my first day, the lady who runs the place gave me a tour. It's not a big place, maybe the size of a small park, with maybe 2 or 3 dozen animals of all species and all sizes at any given time. She showed me where the raccoons are, where the possums are, where the squirrels are. There's even a one-eyed coyote there as a resident, amongst all things. But then, at the end of the showing, she brought me towards a relatively large building. It was wooden, but about the size of 2 cargo containers side by side, with a pretty hefty padlock and some bolts on the entrance, and what looked like a reinforced beam and walls all around. Most of the buildings that housed the refuge animals were in mild disrepair, only as well maintained as they needed to be, but this one looked like someone was taking care of it and repairing it on a weekly basis, if not more frequent. The lady explained to me that this is where they kept the resident deer, Bambi. She had laughed at the name, but then I remembered from reading in the handbook that wildlife refuges aren't even supposed to even have deer, let alone make them a resident, since they're so high maintenance and such a hassle to deal with. I asked her why we had Bambi then, and she explained. Yes, well, Bambi's sort of a special case. It's a bit complicated as to why, but all you need to know is that you don't have to feed her or anything. I do that myself, since she's a bit much to handle at times. Right as she finished her explanation, there was a loud bang from the enclosure that Bambi was housed in. That both looked like and felt like that it had shook the foundations of the place. For a moment, I worried that the walls would collapse and an angry deer would come rushing out. But that, thankfully, didn't happen. Seemed like she's energetic today. I might need some sedatives when I go in. It wasn't strange for the refuge to use sedatives. They were dealing with wild animals, after all. But my mind was immediately struck with the image of this slightly tubby, middle-aged lady taking down a deer with a tranquilizer rifle, which I laughed about a little to myself. I put my concerns about this deer out of my mind though, and just focused on getting trained for the job. Whenever I was near Bambi's building though, I would sometimes hear what I would assume, based on my naive experience from watching too many nature shows, was a deer call. But it was deeper, almost grumbling, much like a large predator animal would make. Plenty of the animals in the refuge made noises, some almost constantly, but the sounds Bambi's were making were quite unsettling compared to what the other animals sounded like. Again, though, I tried not to worry about it, and my first few days working at the wildlife refuge went fine. Sunday before last, though, I saw something that started to make me a bit more concerned about what was going on with Bambi. The lady who ran the place had explicitly told me that she fed Bambi after we closed up shop, around 6 p.m., because the deer were nocturnal and night eaters. I knew that nocturnal deer existed, so this wasn't too worrisome for me. What was worrisome was that what I saw when I was sitting out in my car after my shift was over, texting a friend about my dinner plan. It looked like the manager was making her way over to feed Bambi, and she was carrying 2 things with her as she approached the enclosure. The first was a tranquilizer rifle, at which point I had small, nervous chuckle at my previous idea actually ending up being true. And the second thing was a bag full of something that looked deep red and full of liquid. What I saw in the bag was unmistakable, even from the distance I was at. It was a bag full of raw, bloody meat, enough to feed a group of 20 people at a steakhouse with 2 servings each, if not more. Now, I knew that some deer have been shown to eat meat under specific circumstances, so the concept of Bambi having some steak for dinner wasn't that concerned to me. Instead, it was the sheer amount of raw flesh that was being brought in by the manager, and the fact that it seemed to be only food that she was bringing in. I know that the deer can eat meat, but I'm fairly certain that there's no species of deer that eats only meat. They can be omnivorous, but I've never heard of a purely carnivorous deer. Worried that the manager might get mad if she knew I was watching, I ducked under the dashboard and waited for her to go in, and quickly drove off for dinner with my friends, putting the image of that bag full of raw meat from my mind, as I coincidentally enough had some hamburgers to eat. Now, that could have easily been the end of it, and I had just minded my own business afterwards. But, as any good no-sleeper, my curiosity is too far to be suppressed by common sense. Between the noises that no deer should make, the regular shaking and crashing coming from inside the Bambi's enclosure, and now knowing what deer's daily dinner consisted of, I had to go look. I just had to. I had been entrusted with the keys to the animals' cages and enclosures on my second week, and I quickly realized that there was one key on the ring I didn't use for anything on my daily routine. I figured that it must be to some place that wasn't being used, or maybe that had been decommissioned, or something like that, and I didn't overthink it at the time. This past Sunday, though, I had an idea, one that turned out to be right. I don't know why the manager would keep a key to Bambi's enclosure on the ring that all of her volunteers use, but I wasn't about to question her oversight. I had made my way to the building once I was sure the manager would be busy for a while with some of her office work, and slowly and steadily approached the entrance. I was used to Bambi's banging up against the walls whenever anyone got close, but it still startled me every time it happened. Now, more than ever. More importantly, I hoped that all the noise the deer was making wasn't alerting the manager as to what I was trying to do. Eventually, after what felt like minutes of tiptoeing to the door, I managed to reach the padlock and tried the key. It went in on the first try, which somehow didn't come as a surprise to me. A few bolts later, and I managed to open the front door and opened into an airlock of Bambi's enclosure. All of the other enclosures have a similar system to keep them from getting out whenever we go in to feed or clean them, so this wasn't surprising. What was surprising was just how secure the inner door of the airlock was. If the outer door felt like a bank vault, then the inner door felt like Fort Knox. There must have been 4 or 5 different locks, all of which used the same key, thankfully, and at least half a dozen different bolts. The door itself was heavily reinforced, and felt like, from pushing on it, like it must have weighed quite a bit. Of course, all of these precautions made sense given the strength of Bambi, which I regularly noticed shook the building and was desperately trying to contain her. Right as I had that thought, another such banging came from just inside, along the wall. Thankfully, not on the door, which I felt far louder than it normally was from being inside the building. I silently cursed under my breath at the ruckus Bambi was making and started to undo the inside locks. Normally, we're supposed to secure the outer door of the airlock before opening the inner door, but I wanted to keep an escape route, so to say. I didn't have any plan for Bambi breaking out entirely, but I figured out that I would cross that bridge when I came to it. Once all the locks and the bolts were undone, I very, very slowly opened the door, which was just about as heavy as I thought it would be. My heart pounding in my chest from both nerves and anticipation. This stupid deer that had been in the periphery of my mind for the past month would finally be before my eyes, and I was both excited and terrified. The moment I cracked open the entrance, though the smell hit me before I could see anything, I was vaguely aware of it while outside the building, and slightly more so while in the airlock. But once I opened the door, it slammed into me like a big truck. It was the smell of rotten meat, decaying flesh, and all of the nastiness that comes with those things. The buzzing of flies filled the air, as I had to repress the urge to vomit from the stench. Did this deer even know how to finish her dinner? I heard the buzzing of flies, but no other sound from inside. No snorting, no growling, no stamping of hooves. Nothing. On one hand, I was relieved that I wasn't promptly being charged by an angry deer, but on the other hand, I began to worry that she might be getting ready to ambush me. Did deer even know how to ambush people? As I opened the door a bit more, the first thing I noticed were the eyes. The inside of the enclosure was pretty dark. Few lights embedded the ceiling, a number of them broken, being the only things that illuminated the place since it had no windows. That being said, the two deep red orbs on the deer's face looked like they were glowing embers of fire, and felt like they had the ferocity to match. The second thing that I noticed was her mouth. It was stained red, and what I assumed was blood. It looked as though it was continuously frothing, almost making me think of rabies. But we were supposed to put down any animals with rabies, so that couldn't be what this was. The third thing that I noticed were the antlers. I knew that female reindeer could grow antlers, but this was no reindeer. Not by far. In fact, given the general mass and size of the deer in question, I wasn't even sure that she was any species of deer that I knew of all. Have you ever heard of Samson, the draft horse? He was over 7 feet tall and weighed a little over 1.5 tons. I'm pretty sure that Bambi herself was at least a bit larger than Samson, with some extra muscle mass to boot. Everything about the deer screamed predator, from the rippling muscles to the massive hooves, and I'm fairly certain that one should never get the feeling of predator from a deer in the first place. Bambi's antlers began to scratch along the roof as it started to make its way towards me. Its legs, having enough force behind them to vertebrally shake the ground with each step it took. Oh God, it was making its way towards me. I tried to shut the door as fast as I could, but in my fascination with the creature, I had ended up opening it way too far, that Bambi had enough time to charge its way over to the lodge and open it with its antlers. At this point, I was cursing all of the curiosity that I'd ever had in my life, and my veins began to flood with adrenaline as I fought for what I may know to be my life. This thing would kill me. If it got the chance, and probably would eat me like whatever meat the manager had been feeding it thus far. I quickly realized that there was no way I was going to win a contest of strength with Bambi, especially not against her antlers, and stopped trying to get the door shut. Instead, I grabbed my keyring, put a few keys through the space between my fingers, like I learned in self-defense class, and stabbed at Bambi's neck. I knew that this refuge was here to help animals stay safe and protect them from stuff like this and rehabilitate them. But quite frankly, I'd rather kill an animal that I'm supposed to be taking care of than let some gigantic mutant fuckhead deer have me for dinner. Well, all morality of it aside, it was still a pretty bad idea either way. The keys stabbed as far as they could into Bambi's neck, maybe an inch at the most, but they didn't seem to do much, except make her angry. A second after my mind had time to process how bad of a decision that was, Bambi reared up on her hind legs. How she did that in a building with such a low ceiling, I'm not so sure. She kicked forward, bashing the door open, and the only reason I survived that strike was because of the door itself. As strong as it was, it took enough of the force that I was simply knocked flat on my ass. I was fairly certain, however, that I wasn't going to stay alive for much longer, given that Bambi was now staring down at me with those crimson eyes of hers that gleamed violence and hunger with a glance of light that hit them. I assumed she was going to rear up again in order to stomp me into the ground like meat. But instead, she started to lean down. I wasn't quite sure what she was doing for a few seconds until she opened her mouth. Let me say right now that deer are not supposed to have teeth like that. Incisors, as sharp as knives and about as long, from front to back, about as many as a shark is supposed to have, if not more, with serrated edges. I was fairly certain that Bambi could actually kill and eat a shark if she tried. Viscera and gore were stuck between those monstrous teeth of hers, and as she got closer, I nearly passed out from the smell of all the raw meat on her breath, the temperature of which was almost hot enough to scald my skin. For a moment, I said every prayer from every religion that I could remember, preparing myself for whatever afterlife I would be soon heading to. In the moment that I thought that Bambi was going to chop down on my head, though she didn't. Instead, I heard a thwip sound come from behind me, and the deer whined, and what I presumed was some sort of pain. The sound was still as deep, and if not deeper than a lion's roar, and it retreated back inside of its enclosure. In that second, after that, I thanked my lack of caution for not locking the outside door of the airlock, as the manager was standing there with a tranquilizer rifle I had seen with her before. The lady was angry, sure enough, and I assumed her for a moment that she was just going to shoot me with the rifle next and throw me in there for Bambi to eat. Instead, she went to the door. She locked it as tightly as she could and helped me up. I told you to let me handle Bambi, didn't I? That she did. Between the sheer shock of the situation, my good sense not to push her any further, I didn't really ask any questions about what was up with Bambi, why we were keeping her, or exactly what kind of meat she was eating. The lady didn't fire me or anything either, and I'm still planning on going to work next weekend. But I think I'll be staying away from Bambi's enclosure from now on. I'd rather not end up as the contents of some giant flesh-eating deer's stomach.
I consider myself to be an avid kayaker. I love spending time out on the water where it's quiet, peaceful, and relaxing. There's nothing like spending your day out on blue-green waters, soaking up the sun, without a care in the world. Sadly, up here in North Dakota, there aren't very many options for open water recreation. Typically, people either head towards the Missouri River or to one of the more popular lakes in the state. Most places are packed with people since there isn't a lot to choose from. Now, if you're a passionate kayaker like I am, you'll know where the quiet spots are at. There are a few hidden gems throughout the state that not many people know about. And because I don't want anyone ever going there, I'm going to call my ex-favorite spot Emerald Lake instead of its actual name. I used to call it a hidden gem for a reason. This lake is gorgeous. Its water is unbelievably murky, which sounds the opposite of gorgeous, but it gives off this pretty emerald green color, and it perfectly reflects the sky and surrounding trees. The lake is surrounded by woods. It may not be exciting to you, but in North Dakota, you're lucky to see any trees at all. If you do, they are most likely planted by someone. These trees crown the edge of the lake, giving it a cozy feeling. You really feel like it's just you and the lake. Emerald is maybe 1,000 feet wide and about 3 miles long. Upon first glance, the lake looks to be nothing more than a pond. But if you get towards the back, you'll find a hidden bend that takes you further along, winding in and out of tree-studded hills. In order to get to the lake, you need to travel way back into the countryside on a maze of gravel roads, perfect for keeping this place secret. On one of my days off earlier this summer, I decided to take a kayaking trip out to my precious lake. I asked my best friend to come along with me, because I knew that we'd be the only ones there. During the weekends, you might run into one or two other people, but since I have days off during the work week, I knew we'd be out on our lonesome, perfect for catching up on gossip with your bestie. We loaded our things and set out for a fun day. We arrived at the lake at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and, as expected, there wasn't another soul in sight. Since there's only one way into the lake, and no other vehicles, we were in the clear. You'd need to trespass onto private state land and chop down a few trees to get onto the lake in any other way. I drove down to the water's edge, and we both hopped out to unload our things. I crawled into the bed of my truck to unstrap the kayaks and prepared the paddles. I started to shift the kayaks so that I could get them out more easily. We quickly set up our kayaks and I parked my truck away from the water, in the rare case that someone else came along to enjoy the lake. Right before we launched, my friend stopped what she was doing and turned to face me, with a quizzical expression lining her face. "Did you say something?" my friend questioned. After a few moments of me giving her one of those "are you nuts" type of looks, she resumed. "I swear, I just heard someone. I mean, it sounds like a guy, but obviously you're not a man, so it confused me." I laughed and told her that she was hearing things. She grinned and shrugged it off. So we set off on our journey, enjoying each other's company while discussing the good old days of playing Skyrim for hours on end. We laughed at inside jokes, had a few snacks, drank a few brews, and discussed trivial things. We listened to the birds chirp, watched swallows dive at the bugs around us, and giggled at some very vocal ducks who didn't like being disturbed. At one point, I had paddled over a couple of mallards to try and snap a pic. It's pretty difficult to photograph grumpy waterfowl. Satisfied by what I had captured, I caught up with my friend who had floated ahead. "Did you hear that weird cow?" she asked when I caught up to her. I replied I hadn't heard anything but a couple of angry ducks. "Oh." She looked a bit confused. "I swear I actually heard something this time. It sounded like a really low, almost gravelly moo. It almost sounded like the thing was in pain. I don't know how else to explain it, other than the fact that the sound unnerved me." I gave her a puzzled look. "I don't think there are any cattle in this area." I paused for a bit. Maybe one member of the herd wandered off from somewhere nearby and got hurt, but I think the nearest area would be Price's farm about 25 miles back. We both sat silent and decided to continue on. Neither of us thought much else about it. About an hour into the trip, we reached the end of the lake, or at least what most people assume is the end. We came upon the first of many bends. Knowing that we wouldn't be able to tell if anyone else arrived in the area, which was fine, I glanced over to a cluster of pretty aspen trees and saw a large hawk of some sort sitting at the top of one. Spotting a photo op, I turned to my friend and asked if she wanted to paddle to the other side of the area we were in to check out the lake. Being a less experienced kayaker, she shook her head and told me to head over there. She and I both knew that it would take twice as long if she joined me. I wouldn't have minded, but she didn't want to put in all the extra time and effort. I suggested she just kept heading straight while I checked out the hawk, and I would just meet up with her shortly. She agreed. I began to paddle over to the lovely aspens and the majestic hawk, excited about the neat pictures I'd be getting. The closer I got, the more I began to notice the dead trees. It saddened me to see the trees I always loved, dead and decaying. The situation was sort of odd, though. Why would this entire grove of aspens be dying off? There hadn't been any flooding in several years, and we weren't in a drought currently, so why were they dying? I neared the tree with the hawk in it, cautiously, and before I could snap a pic, the beautiful bird soundlessly took flight and disappeared into the woods. Now by myself, I began to feel this creeping sensation. My skin began to crawl as if tiny little fingers were tapping each inch of my body. My hair stood up on my arms, and I got that empty feeling in your stomach when you know you're completely alone. It dawned on me that I hadn't spotted anything else in a while. No swallows swooping in and out. No irritated ducks. Not even an occasional chirp of a songbird. Nothing. It was dead silent at Emerald Lake, even for an area known for its peace and quiet. This moment was too dead. Due to missing a nice picture and being thoroughly chilled to the core, I switched directions and decided to head for my friend. Out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I'd seen a white aspen move. But it's idiotic. Trees don't move. My brain was just trying to scare me. I ignored it and began to paddle to my friend. I could still see her on the other side of the water and up a bit further, but she wasn't moving. She was completely stuck still, not moving at all. Her face was turned from me, and she was looking at something in the trees, but I couldn't tell what it was. Fearing the worst, I started to power paddle to where she was. It would only take me a few minutes to get to her. Once I was about 10 feet from her, she must have heard me splashing the paddle in the water and turned to me. Her face was white as a sheet, and her eyes showed signs of distress. She waved me over without a word, and my eyes followed the direction she was looking. I saw what she'd been staring at. Among another set of crowded, dead trees was a dirty, cream-colored tent. Now I know what you must be thinking. So what? It's a lake. People like to camp next to lakes all the time. I must remind you, the areas surrounding the lake are technically not open to the public. Only the lake was. You'd have to hike through miles of private land to get here. The tent was ominously perched right on the edge of the water, where it threatened to be consumed by the lake. It seemed abandoned. No one was around, and the site looked like someone had left and not bothered to come back. Bits of trash and miscellaneous camping supplies littered the area surrounding the tent. The little one-man tent was covered in stains, with one side completely split open. I was too bothered by the tent to get any closer to it. Someone had left in a hurry. Chills were running up and down my spine at that point. My friend turned back to me and asked, "I thought you said you weren't really supposed to be on the land surrounding the lake." "You're not," and I reinforced that point with her. I gave her a hesitant shrug and suggested that perhaps whomever it was just didn't realize that you weren't allowed to camp out here. Of course, I didn't really believe that. I worked at a state park for a while, and you get all sorts of people. The ones who break the rules usually know that they're doing so. A lot of vagrants tend to camp out places where no one else is around, even if it's not allowed. Maybe whoever was out here knew they weren't supposed to be here, and got chased off by game and fish or something. They left in a hurry and forgot their tent, she suggested. Maybe, I had mumbled back to her. I couldn't help but wonder why game and fish, or any other authority for that matter, would let a tent just sit out in the open and wither away. I changed the subject. "So, do you want to keep going? Or should we head back to shore and find some place to eat?" A look of relief passed over my friend's face. "I'm starving. Let's head back." I nodded in agreement. We both quickly switched directions and began to paddle away from the lone tent. We didn't get very far before finally realizing that my friend hadn't been hearing things this whole trip. It's just like she had described to me, although I didn't really understand what she had meant until now. It started off as this weird gurgling sound, and grew into this weird rumbling groan. I don't know what to call it. I see why she said it sounded like a moo. Whatever was making the sound was animalistic. It was a low pitch coming from the trees only about 20 feet away or so. Whatever it was, it did sound like it was in pain. But what sort of creature can make a sound like that? My throat was choking on my breath and my rapid heartbeat. I couldn't swallow down my fear of this sound. I knew that whatever was making the noise had to have been just to the right of us. Despite what my brain was screaming at me, I decided to turn my head and search for whatever was making the noise. I wish I hadn't. Peeking around one of the dying aspens was a creature with the palest skin I've ever seen. The thing was so white, it seemed to be able to use the white bark of the aspens to blend in. It was sort of hunched over, with only part of its body visible behind the tree. The creature was human-like in limbs, I suppose. It had 2 legs and arms, but it was skin and bone, hairless from what I could tell. A long, ovular face peered out at us. No eyes, no mouth, just horrifying indentions where they should have been. Imagine the famous The Scream painting, but instead of a screaming mouth, there was just an elongated divot. My eyes began to water. I had been staring at this thing for God knows how long. I heard my friend whimper my name. She saw it too. Without moving, I squeaked at her to paddle as quickly as possible back to shore. My arms burned with the intensity that we were moving, but we couldn't stop. Not with the rustling coming from the trees that was keeping up with us. We were only about 100 feet from shore, and the trees were beginning to thin out to almost nothing where the boat landing was. A little ways behind me, I heard a big splash. There was only one thing that could have made that. Our carp aren't that big. Faster! I screamed at my frightened friend. We were already paddling our hardest, but I didn't know if this thing could swim well or not. We finally got to shore, and the 2 of us practically dove out of our kayaks. I have to get the truck. I don't know why I was yelling when she was right there, but the adrenaline and fear were getting to me. I sprinted to the truck, fumbling around in my bag for the keys. When I finally found them, they slipped through my fingers and clattered out on the ground, just like one of those damn fools you see in horror movies. I hurriedly snatched them back up and flung myself into the truck. Rocks went flying as I hauled ass over to my friend in the kayaks. She was shaking. Any sign of it? I hollered. She shook her head. I haven't seen anything. I don't know whether I should have been relieved or not. Hurry and throw the kayaks into the back. Don't worry about strapping anything down. She did as I said, and together we lifted and tossed both kayaks and their paddles into the bed of the truck. I nearly slipped on the gravel as I ran to get into the driver's seat. I heard it again. I looked behind me to see its head breaching the water. Its empty sockets just staring at me. It was only about 15 feet from the shore. I ripped open the driver's door, and before both of our doors slammed shut, we were driving away. I didn't dare stop to check if we'd had everything, but I swear that when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something white standing on the shoreline where we had been moments before. It's only been a week since our time at Emerald Lake, and I still have no idea what we saw that day.
My grandma was the sweetest woman anyone could have ever met. She was the kind of woman that would give you a piece of candy before bedtime, or take you to the toy store when your parents couldn't. To say we were sad when she passed would be a massive understatement. When I was a small kid, Grandma would never talk about my grandfather. In fact, if you brought him up, when she was around, her attitude would completely change. She would become extremely antisocial, avoiding everyone, completely unlike her normal self. The next time you saw her, she would be completely fine. I didn't understand at the time that this behavior was because my grandpa went missing, but I was a small child, so what do you expect? Along with this strange behavior, my grandma would always keep the basement door locked, and when I asked her about it, she would just tell me that the basement was forbidden, strictly forbidden. I had always wondered what was down there for the most of my childhood, especially since whenever I had gone down there, she would always pull me away. Or if I brought it up in a conversation, she would always change the subject. I always just chalked this up to her strange behavior, but I was never really sure. I've always been a very mischievous person, which is why when I was 13, I stole the basement key from out of her purse when she was sleeping. I crept down to the basement, trying to be very quiet, and I let out a sigh of relief when I made it. A wave of anxiety had left my body, but thinking about what could be in the basement made a whole other wave of anxiety and even nervousness flood my body. Slowly, I turned the key. The basement was dark, musty and damp. It had a strange smell to it, adding to how dirty the basement felt. There was a pull string light at the bottom of the steps. That, when pulled, illuminated the room in a dim and eerie light. It was full of dusty boxes and various items that would mostly be expected in a basement. Except for one thing. In the corner was an armoire, which was completely clean, which made it stand out like a sore thumb. When I inspected it, it was full of medals and other war mementos. It also had a large brown diary on it. When I picked it up, it read, "Property of Private John Miller, 82nd Airborne Division." My grandfather's diary? I said out loud. I contemplated putting it back in the armoire, but I just couldn't help but wonder what was in it. Looking back on this now, I wish that I would have put it back and forgot about it. Ever heard the phrase, "Curiosity killed the cat"? Well, this applies here better than anything. This is what I read. March 23rd, 1968. Myself and a few men from my unit have been ordered to drop behind enemy lines and assassinate someone of importance to the Viet Cong. They didn't give us a lot of details. They didn't even tell us who we were supposed to take out. I guess that they are worried about spies, and if they are this worried, this man must be of extreme importance to the Viet Cong. They will give us more details via radio and on a scrambled frequency. March 24th, 1968. We dropped this last night at 2:40 a.m. in the middle of the jungle. The military had supplied us with AK-47s and various clothing items to blend in with the locals. However, we are also equipped with standard issue US military rifles and uniforms. The nearest village was about 4 clicks to the northwest, so we started walking. We got there almost 7 hours later, at about 8:56 a.m. It was extremely hard to navigate through the thick foliage in the black of night. While it was still dark, I could have sworn I heard the sound of us being followed by something. An animal, maybe. Since we weren't given any flashlights to avoid detection, I had no idea what it was. We arrived at the village and found a place to stay. March 26, 1968. HQ finally radioed back, and in record time too. 2 days. Now if you'll please excuse my sarcasm, they told us that the target was almost 25 miles to the north. I don't know why they couldn't have just dropped us closer to the spot, but I digress. Like I said, navigating through the middle of a jungle is a seriously time-consuming process. March 27th, 1968. I don't like this jungle. I feel like I'm being watched. My squad mates keep telling me it's an animal, but I'm not quite sure. What kind of animal stalks 4 people for 6 hours? It doesn't help that the locals are superstitious either. They kept telling us stories about some terrible supernatural being. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. March 28th, 1968. Our progress has been halted. Seriously halted. Mark broke his leg after he slipped on a wet rock and landed on his foot weird. We have had a lot of bad luck since last night. Our compasses broke mysteriously, None of us can figure out why. And it's not just my compass. It's all of our compasses. Sergeant's map just seems to have disappeared out of nowhere. We contemplated leaving Mark behind, but that would make us no better than those commies that call themselves the Viet Cong. We have no choice but to set up a camp and wait till Mark's leg gets a little bit better. March 29th, 1968. Today, I was scouting when I stumbled upon something disturbing. There I was just walking through this jungle when I stumbled upon a tree with a pentagram carved into it, and above the symbol was the head of a goat stuck into one of the branches. Needless to say, I got out of there fast, and just when I got back to camp, Mark was gone. I asked Sergeant about it, and he had no recollection of Mark even getting up and coming out to the makeshift tent that we had made for him. It's like he never even existed. None of us knew what to do. What if the Viet Cong found our camp and dragged Mark into the jungle to slit his throat? We wanted to move our camp, but what if he came back? What if the Viet Cong didn't find us? We decided to stay the night, but have one of us stay up for half the night until the other guys take over. If any commies come in the middle of the night, we would scream for the guys to wake up. Come morning, Mark doesn't come back, and no soldiers came to slit our throats. We decided to leave our camp behind, but take anything of importance with us. March 30th, 1968. I'm starting to lose hope of getting out of Vietnam. Mark is probably dead, and now it's just me, the sergeant, and Tony. We're starting to run low on MREs, and we've decided to begin rationing our food. Now that our compass is broke and we lost our map, our means of navigation have been disabled. We have to use the stars to navigate. Also, I keep seeing things in my peripheral vision. This jungle is getting to me. Or is it? I think the sergeant sees it too. He's been acting very strangely throughout the past few hours. It seems like he just goes blanks for a few minutes on end, just staring into nothing. Every once in a while, he would turn his head to look at Tony. But there is something in his eyes. Something is wrong. Something is wrong with him. I can see it in his eyes. March 31st, 1968. The sergeant just killed Tony. No context at all. He just aimed his M14 rifle at him and fired a round into his skull. I took off running as fast as my legs would carry, but not without Sergeant unloading an entire magazine in my direction. None of the bullets actually hit me, but one did graze me. I'm bleeding slightly, but it's not too bad. I'm writing this from a small camp that I set up. I made a tent using the Vietnamese clothing supplied to us by the military and some sticks. There's no way I'm getting out of this. I don't have a radio, and I just realized there is someone standing outside my tent. It's not my sergeant. It looks somewhat like a human, but his shadow is demented, has extremely long fingers, and is tall. I can't say how tall, but it almost looks like it's 7 feet tall. I'm going to make a break for it. It's been about 4 hours since that thing found my tent and started following me. It's stalking me. I think I lost it, and now I'm hiding in a tree. The writing just stopped. I was expecting him to write and say that everything was fine, but nothing. So that's when I turned the page. I expected nothing, no more writing, but I could have never expected what happened next. Written in blood were the words,
"He is the Moonlight Man."
I threw the book back into the armoire and ran up into the stairs faster than I have ever in my life. Upstairs, my grandma was sitting in the chair in the kitchen. I tried to speak to her, but no words would come out of her mouth. And that's when I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I passed out. I woke up in a hospital bed, IVs and all sorts of different tubes sticking into my body. I was in there for what was probably 5 minutes, but with how badly my mind was spinning, it felt like 5 hours. A doctor and some of my family members entered the room. A few seconds went by of worried chattering from my family and the doctor. My mother spoke up. She told me that she had come to pick me up from my grandmother's house, and after ringing the doorbell repeatedly with no answer, opened the door and entered the house. After looking for me and my grandmother, she finally entered the kitchen to a sight of me unconscious in the floor, and my dead grandmother slumped over in her chair. She died of a heart attack. After she brought me to the hospital, they discovered that I was severely dehydrated and lacking nutrition, along with several bodily fluids such as blood. But the weird thing is, I was not bleeding anywhere. That was 14 years ago. I am now typing this from my computer after I finally gathered enough courage to go back to her house and retrieve the diary. That is how I could type up those entries word for word. I think that by opening the journal, I unleash something hellish, something demonic. Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm being watched. Heck, I can't even sleep anymore. I'm going outside, and I'm burning this journal.
My name is Matt. I live in a rather small town in the Midwest where I work at our local police station. Nothing out of the ordinary happens here like ever. That is, until a few weeks ago. While walking deep in the woods, someone had come across what appeared to be the door to a cellar. Years of neglect had allowed the surrounding brush to grow over the sides of the door. The person cleared the brush away and managed to get the door open. Immediately, an awful stench came out from the cellar and caused the person to vomit. The next thing we knew, we were getting a report to investigate the contents of that cellar. So we went to check it out. It wasn't very deep, only about 6 feet below the ground. The walls were made of cinder block, while the floor remained dirt. It was approximately 12 feet by 12 feet. We found a large portable construction light in the corner of the room that had been hooked up to a car battery. It was focused on a wooden table that stood directly in the middle of the cellar. That's when the discoveries started to get disturbing. The table was saturated with old blood. Tools such as a hammer, a bone saw, and a hatchet were placed on the table. Blood-stained leather straps were secured to the side of the table as well. The cinder block walls had strange symbols drawn sporadically on them in what was clearly blood. On the floor near the wall farthest from the stairs was a cigar box that contained a journal, as well as a brown cloth bag full of human teeth. This discovery left our department dumbfounded. However, it was somehow the journal that really made things strange. The following is an excerpt from that journal. It appears to have been started on January 22nd of 2008, although nothing of note occurs until April 23rd of 2008. April 23rd, 2008. Something happened today. Something strange. I was walking to my 7 a.m. shift this morning when I began to feel uneasy. I got that classic someone is watching me feeling. I turned around expecting to see nothing but random strangers walking to work. In fact, that was mostly what I saw, but it wasn't everything. Amongst the strangers stood a figure. It was incredibly tall, towering over the rest of the crowd by what seemed to be at least a foot. It appeared to be wearing a black cloak that covered its entire body, including its face. I say this because it had no discernible features other than a head and shoulders. No face, arms, or legs were visible. It just stood there. Despite its utterly blank, black face, I could tell it was staring right at me. Is there something deeper than a stare? If so, that is what it was doing. I froze, rooted to the pavement. Finally, it disappeared. It just vanished. I stood confused for what felt like an hour before someone ran into me and knocked me back to reality. I shook it off as nothing and continued to work. Everything was fine until tonight. I worked a double shift today, so I wasn't able to leave until close. At this point, it was roughly 9:30 p.m. It didn't take long into my trek home until I saw it again. The same feeling fell over me as I turned around and I noticed that it was closer. My best estimate would place the entity to be somewhere from 200 to 300 feet behind me. It stopped as I stopped. It walked as I walked. This time I was relatively alone on my block, which filled me with a deep fear that anchored itself into the pit of my stomach. I felt weak in my knees and wanted to pass out. Without thinking, as if by pure instinct, I sprinted away. I ran faster than I have ever ran in my whole entire life. I didn't look back until I reached the steps of my apartment complex. I decided to turn around and look before going through the door, but I saw nothing. As soon as I stepped into my apartment, I began writing this. I need to write it all down just so that I can see how ridiculous it sounds. I'm already starting to feel better. April 25th, 2008. I had a horrible nightmare last night. I don't even want to remember what happened. The images are still vivid in my head, but I am trying to forget them. I have never dreamt of anything so horrendous in my entire life. I mustn't write down the details so that I can forget. April 25th, 2008. Today was normal for the most part. I only work the night shift. I was hopeful that the events of earlier were finished when nothing out of the ordinary happened yesterday. I was proven to be mistaken when I saw it again today when I was once again walking back from work. It was closer, now only 100 feet away or so. I ran again, hoping to lose it like I did previously. However, this time it kept up with me. It appeared into the depths of my body as it stood a ways away from my apartment steps. It remained for a minute or two, then disappeared as quickly as it seemed to appear. I have no idea why it stayed with me this time. More updates to come. May 3rd, 2008. It has been a week or more since the last time I saw the figure. I have had the same nightmare every night since I first saw it. It appeared again today while I was riding the subway. I was returning from a trip to the YMCA when I glanced around the subway car and it caught my eye. It was sitting at the other end of the car staring at me. This time I could finally get a good look at it. I can't even begin to accurately describe what it looked like. It looked as if someone's shadow had pulled itself off the ground and broke free. This time I could make out its arms and legs due to its sitting position. Its head appeared to be turned to me. Its face was completely featureless. I felt deeply unsettled by its appearance. I couldn't get myself to look at its face for more than a few seconds. Every time I did, I was filled with a level of dread and anxiety that I have never felt before. Looking away made the feeling stop, like putting your hand over a flame and pulling it away once the heat became too much to handle. I got off at the first available stop and went straight home to record this. It did not follow me off the subway. May 4th, 2008. It was back today. All day. I had another double shift, so fortunately I was at work all day, which helped drown it out. It appeared outside my apartment as soon as I left for the day and followed me to work. It was only about 20 feet away from me this time. It has been getting closer every time I see it. It stood outside the window at my work for my entire shift. No one noticed it but me. It followed me home as I left, and appeared to stop outside of my building. Nothing else happened. May 5th, 2008. It's in the room with me. It's still here. It stayed with me all day and, this time, did not stop outside my work nor my apartment. Imagine working all day with a 7-foot figure watching your every move. I can stare at it longer now. Its face is still blank. I can tell because it stands only 5 feet away from me. I cannot tell you how I feel at this moment. It is impossible to articulate the fear that runs through me as I write. I am beginning to accept that it is not going to go away. I fear sleep because I know I will see those things again. That I will experience the same nightmare. At this point in time, the handwriting changes dramatically. It is more frenzied, less meticulous, and overall much more difficult to understand. The following entries were interpreted to the best of our department's abilities. May 28th, 2008. It has been a while since I have used my journal. I just haven't had the motivation. This thing won't leave. It has not left my side in almost a month. I quit my job. I can't keep working in this mental state. I can't shake it and I can't ignore it. The feeling of fear encompasses me at all times. I sit in my room and watch movies all day to try and forget about it. Today, it began to whisper. I cannot understand it, but it is undeniably speaking to me. May 29th, 2008. The whispers are getting louder. I can make out a few words here and there. My updates will become more frequent due to the fact that I no longer have the motivation to do anything but sit. May 29th, 2008. The whispers are becoming more clear. I can't do it. I won't. May 30th, 2008. I can no longer sleep. I suppose this is a good thing. I will no longer have the nightmare. It is speaking at full volume now. It is apparent that it is not actually speaking out loud. Rather, it is speaking to me inside of my own head. Any attempt I make to drown out the voice is fruitless. It has demands. I have sworn that I will not do what it asks. May 30th, 2008. The voice continues. It tells me that if I do what it asks, then it will stop. But I can't. I won't. June 1st, 2008. It is screaming now. I have not been able to sleep in days. I have become desperate to stop the noise. Self-mutilation does no good. I have not left the house. My appetite is almost completely gone despite not eating in days. I will waste away to nothing before I do what it asks. June 3rd, 2008. I had to. Please do not judge me. I had no choice. The voice, it wouldn't stop. It led me to the child, to the forest. It told me where to dig. It told me what to do. I had to do what it asked. I no longer feel anything. I can't get the memories out of my head. I did not know I was capable of such things. When I did what it asked, it stopped for a while to grant me sleep. For a few hours I was free. I had no nightmare, no dreams, just nothing. I will do whatever it takes to get that feeling back. June 6th, 2008. It has told me the truths. It has told me the secrets. It tried to show me before through my nightmares, but I did not understand. Now I do. I know now that what I have done was good. Just know that this is not the end. When it is done with me, it will find another. And when I finally die, I will be rewarded for what I have done. The remaining 48 pages of the journal are filled with unrecognizable and completely unknown writings, symbols, and drawings. No one has any clue on how to interpret what language is being used, as well as what the symbols mean. The drawings range from the innocent, like a wilted flower, to the grotesque, like severed limbs, detailed acts of violence. It became clear right away that we were not going to be able to figure out what had taken place in that cellar. The crime scene appeared to be much too dated to gather any serviceable data from. The condition of the crime scene, the dates in the journal entry, and the amount of brush covering the entrance showed that the cellar had not been used in years. The case is clearly way above the pay grade of our small police department, and far beyond our means to solve. As a result, most of the department simply wants to cover it up and pretend like they never saw it. I can't blame them personally. The reality of the situation was that something horrible took place in that cellar, and that we would probably never know who did it. Over the past couple of weeks, almost everyone has moved on. Except for me. which is why I'm writing this. I can't get it out of my head. I've even started seeing things. Weird things that I can't explain. There is one line from the journal in particular that has been keeping me up at night. When it is done with me, it will find another. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. Maybe it's because I saw something the other day. Something that I know is true, but I can't admit. Something that, if it were true, would mean that I am just as crazy as whoever wrote that journal. Please, if anyone is reading this and knows anything about what is going on, help me. I am all out of options.